Welcome back, everybody, to our series on world building. We are continuing to unravel these different elements that we talked about in our first video, and today we're going to be talking about geography. This is something that JC and I have talked about at length as really one of the first steps that we dive into when we're starting to build a world in our Dungeons & Dragons campaign. And I'm just going to throw the talking stick over to John and let him talk about where he begins in creating that world, specifically in map creation. Are you looking for a new grim, dark steampunk setting to introduce to your players? Well, Dungeon Brew has created a campaign setting manual called Thegum, and it is now available for your support on BackerKit. It has new rules for magic disruption in regions. There are rules to create your own corrupted gods to introduce to your players. There are new rules for mechanics in regards to the firearms for the new steampunk weapons that are being introduced, and there is new magic, new species, new subclasses, new factions, and so much more that's being included in this manual. You can go download a PDF sample on the BackerKit and see what all we have put into it, but right now we need your dice at our table, so head on over. We'll see you there.
So the interesting thing about map creation is, honestly, sometimes I get to map creation before I get to inspiration and before I get into genre and theme. Sometimes it is step one in this process because I really enjoy having an empty map in front of me and then filling it in and letting my imagination just kind of go wild with it. And when we're talking about creating maps, it can be pretty daunting, especially when you're talking about world size. I'm not an artist by any means, so I've drawn maps in the past, but I'm also not a cartographer. So when it comes to like putting in rivers the way that they should appear or mountain ranges in the way that they should go, I have a general understanding of how it should go, but it's not always perfect. But for the most part, unless it's something that you're really wanting to put out there as official, I don't think you need to worry about any of those concerns. This is something that you're engaging in for enjoyment for yourself and your group, and oftentimes people are excited or accepting of just having something that's been handmade rather than trying to make something that's perfect. So I just wanted to get that part out of the way first.
Which I think is an important piece, because I struggle with the same thing. I'm curious, when you're building a world, do you start small and work your way outward, or do you start big and work your way inward, or is it kind of a mixture of both?
Well, it's kind of, we've talked about this before. Like, it's the bouncing ball method, where you bounce the ball and it narrows in and goes down, and then you go back up and down and up. But when it comes to drawing the map, most of the time I will start with very large continent shapes, and then I will zoom in on a region and then zoom back out, and then zoom in on a region and zoom back out. That's how I tend to approach it. I like having the continent shapes just so that I get a sense of it, almost like looking at our own, the map of Earth type of a thing, where you have it all spread out and you can look at it. So, it's a little bit back and forth. So in regard to this, because we're talking about Greece specifically, we'll try and focus back in on that here for the rest of this conversation. We want to look at a variety of things with map creation, because specifically we're talking about the way that the Mediterranean kind of looks. And we want to take the Mediterranean type of topography and geography and blow that up to world size. So we're looking at something that has a lot of coastlines, a lot of mountainous regions, and a ton of islands. And we want to populate that on a world scale, so it's just that sensation of always being someplace that's kind of Greek, I guess. And then from there, we kind of have to continue on and build out in terms of like climate and that type of thing. So I wasn't sure. Do you want to talk about that maybe a little bit?
Yeah, so looking at ancient Greece, I think you're hitting all the major features there that you're going to want to put into your world. And I like how you're specifying that you're taking this small region in our known world and you're kind of blowing it up to its own world to have that be the setting for what you're creating for your
players and characters to go through in the course of world building. But absolutely, we know that Greece is about 80% mountainous, about 20% farmland that they utilize, and then it's all about those coastlines and those islands, which of course we just know islands are mountains that are kind of poking out of the water. But this gives you the opportunity to create volcanic regions potentially, building city-states on other opposite sides of those mountainous regions, which is very, again, reflective of what ancient Greece looked like. This is why they had to use coastline so much to travel around, because it was faster to get from city to city in the course of trade than just trying to go over the top of mountains from city-state to city-state.
Right.
And then some of this will come up in culture as well as we're talking about it. But that development of just your basic topography, as you're saying, in terms of having mountain regions separate your city-states when you're kind of zooming back in or bouncing the ball back down and zooming in, allows you to specify places on your map of where you're going to build those civilizations. And then, of course, how does this relate to fresh water that's running down from the mountains, where your streams at and your rivers at, you're going to build those civilizations next to, where your more monstrous creatures going to be located at on your larger map based on themselves. And we talked about this a little bit too, but you may have centaurs or minotaurs actually be their own race within this world, and so you're going to have to find those different areas on your map, maybe in your plains, those very limited grassland areas for your centaurs to live in instead of putting them up in the mountains. I don't know. Other thoughts that you have and how you would develop this, or things that you're thinking about?
So yeah, definitely. This is also the stage, like you mentioned, where you start deciding, and this bleeds into culture a little bit. You start deciding what types of cultures, what types of races inhabit the world. And if you're sticking with Greek themes, then minotaurs and centaurs do kind of make sense. You're not going to have centaurs on the coastline. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. The idea of a centaur on a ship seems a little bit comical. And you might think the same thing about minotaurs, but in the Dragonlance series, minotaurs were the notorious seafarers in that setting, and so you could definitely pull from that and look at the culture of the minotaurs and the way that that was built if you want to look for another source of inspiration for how they might fit into the world. Now, all of those things being said, you were talking about various topographies, such as the mountains and the freshwater and that type of thing. It is important. This is the stage where I start locating where I want people to be. So, and usually this is terrain features that catch my eye, that it's like, oh, this is a really interesting region. I really like the idea of having a culture that comes from this area. Or this seems like there's all of these lakes, or there's all of these rivers and that type of thing. So I could definitely see this being a huge population center. So I start to pepper the map with capitals. And then from there, I kind of build out and go, okay, so where are the natural boundaries for these things? If you've got mountains all the way around a certain region and I centered a culture there, it's not likely that their borders are going to extend beyond that mountainous region. They probably are going to extend out into the waters, into the sea, into the ocean, because that's going to be an easier avenue for moving their civilization than back the other direction. So all of that kind of stuff bleeds back and forth, and this is going to be true the more that we move through some of these, that you start having to juggle what pieces make sense at this stage and at later stages in the world creation process. So yeah, you may get into a place where you're building culture and something just doesn't seem to necessarily make sense with the geography, and you have to go back to your geography stage and start like moving the boundary lines or the pins a little bit on how things function. Another thing that I think is really important in this stage 2 for geography is understanding what the climate's going to be in your regions too, and this is going to affect the culture piece when you get there, and that's why it's so important to think about it at this step. We know Greece was a pretty mild climate overall. I mean, their summers were pretty dry, their winters were pretty wet, but it didn't really ever get above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And so that's going to impact later what clothing they're wearing, where they're traveling at, how that's going to impact their
their seafaring, on all these types of things for, low tide and high tide and how that's going to look in terms of their seasons as well, which they typically had about 4 seasons, but they were more set on the summer and winter months. But all those things, again, are things that I start kind of jotting notes down for each little area within my world, so I have an idea of it before I jump into culture.
Well, and you also have to decide at this stage how committed you are to the inspiration of Greek culture, for instance, because you may not necessarily like the idea of having a relatively mild climate all the time. And when you're dealing with a world map, it doesn't always make a ton of sense that, the poles of your world don't have extreme temperatures of some kind, or the equator region doesn't have extreme temperatures of some kind. So you have to decide at this stage, or as you're moving forward and you're determining these things, does my world follow traditional laws of the way that the climates should work? And for some of that, it may make more sense than other areas, and that's where I was talking about don't get too bogged down in the details. Have fun with it and kind of play around with it, but don't expect it to be perfect.
Yeah, and I appreciate you pointing that out, because I have made this mistake before where I was way too literal, where I was like, oh nope, this is going to be Greek, and these are the random tables I'm going to be using for monsters that are in this area, because that's what fits for these different types of climates. And I really kind of strong-armed myself from being able to give much variety within that world, because I didn't expand it enough to be able to bring in other types of creatures and civilizations or experiences into that world building, because it was so limited.
Right. So I think one of the last things that I do want to cover in this is just kind of how to go about actually creating the map. And like I mentioned before, I've gone a variety of ways. I've hand-drawn maps before. That's how I first started 25 years ago.
Thank God for technology.
Right. Before I had access to anything else, I hand-drew my maps. As I developed some skills in other areas, I started to auto-generate maps through basically using some algorithms and GIMP in order to be able to create a kind of color-coded map that I then used to generate a topography off of. But by far the easiest and probably the most thorough thing that I've come across is Asgar's map generator, and we'll put a link down below to that. It's a free tool that you can find online. There's a city generator version of this as well. But it will generate coastlines, mountains, forests, climate. It will put all of your cities on your map. It will put all of that information on the map, and all of it is customizable. So you can go through and make your entire map, and before you get too bogged down in the details, you can start playing with the coastlines. You can start doing a ton of stuff. I mention this because it's something that I use and something that I enjoy, not because there's any other ulterior motive here. It's a great tool, and it's something that you should definitely check out if you're interested in getting started with map building, and the idea of it seems intimidating in some way.
Yeah, I absolutely love those generators that are out there, just because it allows me to spend more time focusing on the story and building the actual campaign pieces, because I too used to draw worlds by hand, and while that's fun in its own right, you're going to delay your gameplay for some time while you're spending time drawing maps.
Yeah, it's a time-consuming process, and really that's the biggest thing. If you're more professional or more skilled at it than either of us, I'm sure you can do it more quickly. But for both of us, it's a time-consuming process, and it can be therapeutic to do. But if you don't have a lot of time on your hands, it's not always possible.
All right. We'll see you guys next week when we talk about culture.
Yep.
Dungeon